When liberal TV host Sarah Chen asked Donald Trump about his father, no one expected the raw, emotional response that would change hearts across America. The question wasn't just about family, it was about healing a divided nation, and what happened next left everyone in tears. Before we dive into the story, share in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The studio lights burned unusually bright that evening at CNN's headquarters. Sarah Chen, the first Asian American woman to host a primetime political show, sat across from Donald Trump, watching him adjust his signature red tie for the fourth time. The air felt heavy with anticipation. Don't make it personal. Stick to policy. Her producer's warning echoed in her mind. But Sarah couldn't shake the memory of her father's words from 20 years ago, spoken in their small apartment above their family restaurant in Queens. In America, even enemies must sit at the same table sometimes. The carefully selected audience, a deliberate mix of Trump supporters and critics, sat in tense silence. They had already covered the expected territory: the economy, foreign policy, his legal challenges. Trump had navigated each question with his characteristic blend of bravado and counter-accusations, leaving Sarah's carefully crafted follow-ups floating in his wake. But she had saved one question for last, the one her producer had explicitly warned her not to ask. In the front row, an elderly couple wearing matching MAGA hats clutched each other's hands. Behind them, a young woman in a Black Lives Matter t-shirt leaned forward, her eyes fixed intently on the stage. These weren't just audience members. They were living symbols of America's deepening divide. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her notes. The teleprompter's red light blinked steadily, but she wouldn't need it for this. The question had been burning inside her for months, shaped by her own family's immigrant experience and the growing chasm she saw splitting communities apart. "Mr. Trump," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I'd like to ask you something different." She paused, watching as he leaned back in his chair, that familiar mixture of defensiveness and curiosity crossing his face. "It's about your father." The slight twitch in Trump's jaw was barely noticeable, but Sarah caught it. Fred Trump had always been a complex subject for him, and everyone in the media knew it. But this wasn't about scoring political points. This was about something deeper. As she prepared to ask the question that would change everything, Sarah remembered her father's other lesson. Sometimes the hardest questions are the ones that heal us. The studio fell silent. What came next would spark a national conversation about family, legacy, and the power of vulnerability in American politics. Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers pressing lightly against her note card. Every instinct honed over years of journalism told her this moment mattered, not for ratings or viral clips, but for something more fundamental. "You've spoken often about your father Fred's influence on you," she continued, her voice softening. "If he were alive today, watching how divided our country has become, with families, friends, and neighbors no longer speaking to each other, what do you think he would say to you, personally, about your role in that division?" The studio fell so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Trump's usual rapid-fire response didn't come. Instead, something flickered across his face, a flash of vulnerability that made him look, for just a moment, less like a former president and more like a son remembering his father. His fingers drummed against the armrest, a rare sign of uncertainty from a man known for his unwavering confidence. The audience sat frozen, phones raised but forgotten in their hands. The young woman in the Black Lives Matter shirt had unconsciously leaned forward. The elderly couple had unclenched their hands. When Trump finally spoke, his voice was different, lower, more contemplative. "You know, my father," he began, then stopped. For perhaps the first time in his political career, Donald Trump seemed to be carefully choosing his words. "My father built something real," he continued, his tone carrying an unfamiliar weight. "He built homes where families could live. Real homes, not just buildings. He used to take me to construction sites in Queens when I was just a kid. He'd pick up a nail from the ground and say, 'Donald, this nail matters as much as the whole building.' Trump's eyes seemed distant now, fixed on a memory rather than the cameras. He believed in doing things right, not just doing them big. Sometimes, I wonder. His voice trailed off, and for a moment the studio held its collective breath. Sarah leaned forward slightly. "What do you wonder, Mr. Trump?" He shifted in his chair, his usual bravado temporarily stripped away. "I wonder if he'd recognize what we've become as a country, the way we fight, the way we tear each other down. He was tough, sure, but he believed in building things that brought people together." A murmur rippled through the audience. On social media, the live feed comments exploded. No one had seen Trump like this before. Reflective, almost vulnerable. You know, when he dealt with people, whether they were contractors, tenants, whoever, he'd always say, "Remember, Donald, these are people with families." He wasn't soft. He was smart. He knew that dividing people might win you a battle, but it wouldn't build anything lasting. Trump paused, his hand moving unconsciously to straighten his tie again. "I've built different things than my father. Bigger things, maybe. But sometimes I think about those nails he'd pick up, about how he'd say every piece matters." Sarah felt the weight of the moment. In her earpiece, she could hear the control room's stunned silence. Even her producer, who had warned against this line of questioning, wasn't saying a word. "So, if he were here today," Trump continued, his voice growing stronger but maintaining that unusual thoughtfulness, "I think he'd remind me of something I might have forgotten along the way." The tension in the studio was electric. Camera operators exchanged glances. The audience seemed to lean forward as one. In that moment, the usual barriers between Trump supporters and critics seemed to blur, replaced by a shared curiosity about what this powerful man would reveal about his relationship with his father. "He'd probably pull me aside like he used to at those construction sites," Trump continued, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And he'd say something that would change everything, something that would make me see all of this differently." Trump's hands, usually so animated during interviews, lay still in his lap. His next words would not only stun the audience but spark a national conversation about leadership, legacy, and the true meaning of making America great. Trump leaned forward in his chair, his voice taking on a tone that few had ever heard before. "My father would say, 'Donald, what are you building and what are you breaking?' That's what he'd ask me. Because for him, there was never any glory in destruction." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Sarah noticed a subtle shift in the audience, the young woman in the BLM shirt wiping her eye, the elderly couple exchanging glances. "You know, when he started in Queens," Trump continued, "people thought he was crazy, building homes for working families when Manhattan was where the real money was. But he understood something I maybe lost sight of along the way." He paused, running his hand along the arm of his chair. He knew that real success wasn't about winning every battle. It was about creating something that outlasts you. Sarah sensed the moment's gravity. "And do you think he'd be proud of what you've built?" The question seemed to hit Trump like a physical force. For several seconds, he didn't speak. When he did, his voice carried an unfamiliar strain. "My father was a complicated man," he began slowly. "He pushed us hard, me, my siblings, to be successful. But success to him meant something different than what it's become today. He'd look at Twitter, at social media, at the way we tear each other apart, and he'd say, 'Donald, this isn't building, this is burning.'" A woman in the audience let out an audible sob. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats as if Trump's words had touched something raw within them. "I remember once," Trump continued, his eyes focusing on some distant point, "we were walking through one of his developments. Must have been in the late 60s. There were kids playing in the courtyards, black kids, white kids, immigrant families. He turned to me and said, 'See this, Donald? This is what America looks like when you build it right.'" The studio lights seemed to dim, or perhaps it was just the intensity of the moment making everything else fade away. Trump's usual defensive posture had disappeared, replaced by something more authentic, more human. He'd be disappointed, Trump said finally, the admission seeming to cost him something. Not in the success. He'd love the buildings, the brand, all of that, but he'd be disappointed in how we've lost sight of what we're supposed to be building together as a country. Sarah leaned forward. What do you think he'd want you to do differently? Trump's response came with unexpected candor. He'd tell me to stop treating every disagreement like a war. That was one of his biggest lessons. You don't have to destroy someone to succeed. He'd say, Donald, you're so busy winning that you've forgotten what you're fighting for. In the audience, something remarkable was happening. The visible line that had separated Trump supporters from critics began to blur. People were nodding, regardless of their political leanings, some wiping away tears. You know what else he'd say? Trump continued, a hint of his familiar energy returning, but tempered now with reflection. He'd tell me that all these fights we're having, about race, about politics, about who belongs and who doesn't, they're missing the point. Because when you're building something real, something that matters, you need everyone. Every nail, every board, every hand that's willing to work. A murmur of agreement rippled through the studio. Sarah noticed her producer had gone completely silent in her earpiece, letting the moment unfold naturally. My father wasn't perfect, Trump acknowledged, his voice growing stronger. He made mistakes, had his controversies, but he understood something fundamental about America, that it's not just a place where people compete to win, it's a place where people come together to build something bigger than themselves. The confession seemed to open a floodgate. Trump began sharing stories about his father that he'd never told publicly, moments of wisdom, of tough love, of lessons learned and sometimes forgotten. Each anecdote revealed a different side of both men, painting a picture of a complex relationship that had shaped not just a family, but in many ways the nation itself. As he spoke, the atmosphere in the studio transformed. The usual political tensions melted away, replaced by something more profound, a shared recognition of our common humanity, of the universal struggle between parents and children, between ambition and wisdom, between the desire to win and the need to build. There was this one time, Trump continued, his voice taking on a warmth few had heard before, when one of our projects was facing opposition from local community groups. I wanted to fight, to push through with lawyers and pressure, but my father sat me down and said something I've never forgotten, though maybe I haven't always followed it. He paused, and the entire studio seemed to hold its breath. The next words would spark conversations in homes across America, challenging both supporters and critics to see beyond their entrenched positions. If you're enjoying this story so far, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It costs you nothing, but for us, especially in these early days, it means the world. Let's continue with what happens next. He said, Donald, when people fight you, it's usually because they're afraid of something. Find out what they're afraid of, and maybe you can build something better together. Trump's voice carried a note of regret. That's the kind of wisdom I sometimes wish I'd listened to more. In the audience, phones had lowered. Social media updates seemed suddenly unimportant compared to the raw humanity unfolding before them. The elderly couple in MAGA hats were holding hands again, but differently now. Not in defiance, but in shared emotion. You know, Trump continued, leaning forward, my father wasn't just a builder of buildings. He was a builder of communities. That's something I didn't really understand when I was younger. I was always looking at the next big deal, the next headline. But he'd look at a neighborhood and see something different. He'd see families who needed homes, kids who needed playgrounds, people who needed a chance. Sarah noticed her own hands trembling slightly as she gripped her notes. This wasn't just an interview anymore, it was becoming a moment of national reflection. Mr. Trump, she ventured carefully, how do you think that perspective might change your approach to leadership today? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the studio, really seeing the faces in the audience for perhaps the first time that evening. His eyes lingered on the young woman in the Black Lives Matter shirt, then on the elderly couple, then on a group of younger supporters near the back. You know what's interesting? He said finally. Looking at everyone here tonight, I'm reminded of something else my father taught me. He said, "Donald, in construction, if you build walls wrong, they crack under pressure. But if you build them right, they support everything above them." He paused, letting the metaphor sink in. Maybe that's what we've been doing wrong in this country. We've been building walls to divide when we should have been building foundations to support. A collective murmur of recognition swept through the studio. Several audience members nodded, some wiping away tears. Even the camera operators seemed moved. "My father would look at America today," Trump continued, his voice growing stronger but maintaining its reflective quality, "and he'd see what any good builder sees when something's not working, the cracks in the foundation. He wouldn't blame the Democrats or the Republicans. He'd say, 'Donald, when a building's foundation is cracking, you don't argue about who caused it. You fix it.'" The control room remained silent in Sarah's earpiece, but she could sense this was becoming something historic. This wasn't just another political interview. It was a moment of vulnerability that was somehow making everyone present feel both smaller and larger at the same time. "You want to know something I've never told anyone?" Trump said, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "The night before my inauguration, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my father, about what he would say if he could see me then. And I realized something that scared me. I wasn't sure if he would be proud of how I got there, even if he was proud that I got there." The admission hung in the air like a heavy weight. Several audience members audibly gasped. This level of vulnerability from Donald Trump was unprecedented. He always said, "Donald, your name is on the building. That means something." But I don't think he just meant it as a point of pride. I think he meant it as a responsibility. Trump's voice had grown quieter, but in the silence of the studio, every word carried. When your name is on something, you're not just responsible for whether it stands or falls. You're responsible for every life it touches. Sarah leaned forward slightly. "And how do you think that applies to having your name on the presidency?" The question could have been a trigger for his usual defensive posture, but something had shifted. Trump's response came with a thoughtfulness that surprised everyone. "You know what my father would say about that? He'd say, 'Donald, the presidency isn't a building you own. It's a building you look after for a while, and then you pass it on to the next person. Make sure you leave it stronger than you found it.'" "That's the thing about my father," Trump continued, his hands now relaxed in his lap. "He understood that everything we build, whether it's buildings or businesses or a country, it's not just about us. It's about what we leave behind." A young man in the audience, wearing a button-down shirt with both a small American flag pin and a pride flag pin, raised his hand tentatively. Sarah glanced at her producer through the studio glass, who nodded slightly. "Go ahead," Sarah said, gesturing to the young man. "Mr. Trump," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "I haven't spoken to my parents since 2020. They support you, and I don't. But listening to you talk about your father, I wonder if you have any advice about bridging that kind of gap." The question seemed to touch something deep in Trump. He shifted forward, his expression softening further. "You know what my father would say about that," he responded, his voice carrying a gentle authority that few had heard before. "He'd say we're looking at it all wrong. In construction, when there's a gap, you don't just stare at it and complain. You build a bridge, and the first step isn't about who's right or wrong, it's about making sure the foundation on both sides is solid." The young man nodded, tears forming in his eyes. Trump wasn't finished. "My father taught me that in business, your toughest opponents often become your strongest partners, if you're willing to find common ground. Maybe that's what we've forgotten as a country. We're so busy being right that we've forgotten how to build bridges." Sarah noticed more hands rising in the audience. The atmosphere had transformed from a political interview into something resembling a town hall on healing. Her producer's voice finally crackled in her earpiece. "Let it happen. This is extraordinary." A middle-aged woman in a teacher's union shirt stood up. "Mr. Trump, hearing you talk about your father's wisdom, it makes me wonder, what do you think he'd say about how we treat each other on social media?" Trump let out a short, knowing laugh. Oh, he would hate it. He'd absolutely hate it. He'd say, "Donald, you can't build anything meaningful with 280 characters of anger, and you know what? He'd be right." He paused, seeming to reflect deeply. My father believed in face-to-face conversations. He'd say, misunderstandings happen when people forget they're talking to human beings. The candor of his response sparked something in the room. More people began sharing their own stories of family divisions, of broken friendships, of communities torn apart. And with each story, Trump's responses became more personal, more reflective, drawing on his father's wisdom rather than his usual political rhetoric. "You know what the hardest lesson my father ever taught me was?" Trump said, addressing the entire room now. He said, "Donald, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you were wrong. I didn't understand that for a long time. Maybe I still don't fully understand it. But I'm starting to think he was right about that, too." The admission sent a ripple through the studio. Social media would later explode with clips of this moment, but right now, in the studio, it felt intimate and genuine. Sarah glanced at her notes, then set them aside. The interview had transcended her prepared questions. "Mr. Trump, what do you think your father would want you to say to the American people right now? Not as a politician, but as someone who learned from a builder of communities." Trump's answer would become one of the most shared and discussed political moments of the year, not for its controversy, but for its unexpected power to heal. Trump sat silently for a moment, his eyes scanning the faces in the studio. The usual bravado had completely fallen away, replaced by something more authentic. "My father would want me to say something very simple," he began, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone lean forward. "He'd want me to say that we've forgotten the most important part of making America great. It's not about winning or losing. It's not about left or right. It's about building something that lasts." He stood up suddenly, surprising everyone. Sarah tensed slightly, unsure where this was going. But Trump's next move left the entire studio in stunned silence. He walked over to the young man who'd spoken about his parents, then to the woman in the Black Lives Matter shirt, and finally to the elderly couple in MAGA hats. Standing in the middle of them all, he looked different. Not like a politician, but like a builder surveying a project. "Look at us," he said, gesturing to the diverse audience. "My father would see this and say, 'Donald, these are your materials. Every person, every belief, every difference, these are your building blocks. What are you going to build with them?'" His voice grew stronger, but not in his usual confrontational way. Instead, it carried the tone of someone finally speaking their truth. "I've done a lot of things in my life. Built towers, created businesses, became president. But standing here tonight thinking about my father's words, I realized something." He paused, and the studio held its breath. "Maybe I've been measuring success by the wrong standard." The elderly woman in the MAGA hat dabbed her eyes with a tissue. The young man with the pride pin gripped his seat. Everyone seemed to sense they were witnessing something extraordinary. "My father used to say, 'Donald, a building isn't just steel and concrete. It's the lives that happen inside it.' Maybe that's what we need to remember about America. It's not just borders and laws and policies, it's the lives we build together." Sarah watched as phones emerged again, but not for partisan posts or angry tweets. People were recording this moment, sensing its historical significance. "You know what else my father would say?" Trump continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the studio. "He'd say, 'Donald, when you've dug yourself into a hole, the first step to building something new is to put down the shovel.'" A ripple of nervous laughter mixed with sniffles spread through the audience. Trump smiled, not his usual camera-ready grin, but something more genuine. "So, maybe that's where we start. Maybe we all need to put down our shovels, stop digging these divides deeper, start remembering what my father never forgot, that the real measure of success isn't in what you build for yourself, but in what you build for others." The young woman in the Black Lives Matter shirt stood up slowly. "Mr. Trump," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Trump turned to face her directly. His response would trigger headlines across the globe and spark a movement that no one could have predicted. "Yes," Trump replied, holding her gaze. "I'm saying that my father would look at me today and say, 'Donald, it's time to be a builder again, not a divider.' And you know what? He'd be right." He turned to address the entire room, but his words felt personal, as if he were speaking to each person individually. "When I was young, watching my father work, I saw him do something remarkable. He would sit down with people who opposed his projects, community activists, local politicians who hated him, even competitors, and he'd say, 'Let's find a way to build something better together.'" The studio remained completely silent, hanging on every word. Trump's voice grew stronger, more passionate, but maintained that unusual humility. "I've spent years being proud of being a fighter, maybe too proud. But my father, he knew something I forgot along the way. He knew that the greatest satisfaction doesn't come from defeating others. It comes from building something that makes everyone's lives better." Suddenly, the young man with the pride pin stood up. "My parents," he said, his voice cracking, "they always taught me that America is about second chances. Do you think it's too late for all of us to start over?" Trump's response came with unexpected gentleness. "My father would say it's never too late to lay a new foundation. But, and this is important, he'd also say that the strongest foundations are built on truth. So, let me tell you some truth." He paused, taking a deep breath. The next words would be replayed millions of times across social media, analyzed on every news network, and discussed in homes across America. "I've contributed to the division in this country. More than contributed. I've fueled it, used it, profited from it. My father wouldn't be proud of that. He'd say, 'Donald, you're breaking faster than you're building.'" Gasps echoed through the studio. Sarah felt tears forming in her own eyes, but maintained her professional composure. Her producer's voice whispered in her ear, "This is incredible. Let him keep going." "But here's what else my father would say," Trump continued. "He'd say, 'It's not enough to admit you've been breaking things. You have to start building something better. And that's not something any one person can do alone. Not even a president or former president." He walked back to his chair but remained standing. "You know what else my father taught me?" He said, "Donald, when you're really building something worthwhile, your biggest critics often become your most valuable advisors. Maybe that's where America needs to start, by turning critics into collaborators." The woman in the Black Lives Matter shirt wiped tears from her cheeks. The elderly couple in MAGA hats reached over and squeezed her hand. Something was shifting in the studio, not just in the atmosphere, but in people's hearts. "So here's what I propose," Trump said, his voice now carrying the authority not of a politician, but of someone speaking from deep conviction. "Let's stop fighting about who broke America and start talking about how we rebuild it, together, the way my father would have wanted." As he spoke these words, something remarkable happened in the studio audience. People began reaching across the aisle, literally and figuratively. The invisible barriers between Trump supporters and critics started dissolving, replaced by subtle nods, shared tissues, and understanding glances. Sarah noticed her hands were shaking as she prepared to ask her next question. But before she could speak, Trump had one more thing to say, something that would set in motion a chain of events that would transform American political discourse. "My father once told me," Trump said, his voice carrying both strength and humility, "that the true test of a builder isn't in what stands while you're watching, but in what remains standing long after you're gone." Tonight, I'm asking all of America, what are we building that will outlast our anger? The impact was immediate and profound. Across the studio, people who had entered as opponents were now exchanging phone numbers, making plans to talk more, to understand each other better. The young man with the pride pin was already dialing his parents, tears streaming down his face. Within hours, the interview went viral, but not in the usual way of political soundbites and angry tweets. Instead, people shared full clips, entire segments, wanting others to feel what they had felt watching it. The hashtag, #WhatAreWeBuilding, started trending nationwide. Sarah received thousands of emails in the days that followed. A woman in Ohio wrote about hosting her first family dinner in 3 years, bringing together relatives who hadn't spoken since the 2020 election. A community in Florida started a Building Bridges program where people with opposing political views worked together on local improvement projects. The media landscape shifted too. News channels began featuring stories of reconciliation alongside their political coverage. Talk show hosts started asking different questions, focusing less on division and more on common ground. Trump himself seemed transformed by the experience. His social media posts took on a different tone, reflecting more of his father's builder mentality. He began hosting Building Together forums, where former opponents worked to find solutions to community problems. But perhaps the most powerful impact was in the quiet moments that no camera captured. In living rooms across America, families began having different conversations. Instead of arguing about who was right or wrong, they started asking, "What can we build together?" A month after the interview, Sarah received one final letter that brought everything full circle. It was from the elderly couple in MAGA hats, writing jointly with the young woman in the Black Lives Matter shirt. They had started a community center together in their town, dedicated to bringing diverse groups together for constructive dialogue. Their letter ended with words that captured the spirit of what had happened that night. Sometimes it takes a reminder of what we can build to help us forget what we thought we needed to destroy. Thank you for asking the question that helped us all remember. We're not just citizens of a country. We're builders of its future. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes the greatest changes start with a simple reminder of what we can build together.